This is one of China's most affluent commercial and residential areas, Sanlitun Village in East Beijing. Now, even here, migrant workers from less affluent parts of the country can be found trying to scratch a living. They're part of an army of millions of people from the countryside who come here to the cities literally to seek their fortune. But it's not always that easy. Seen by some city dwellers as a liability or a burden, they can face discrimination, certainly difficulties in integrating with those here. But behind these gleaming buildings with their brand name shops is an unusual exhibition aimed at explaining why migrant workers not only should but must be included if cities like Beijing are to thrive. The organisation behind it is called Included.org, and I'm going to ask its founder, Jonathan Hursh, just why migrant workers are so crucial to inclusion in our world today. Jonathan Hursh, welcome to On the Level.
Thank you for having me.
Now, we're sitting here in a shipping container in a posh shopping mall in Beijing. What is this all about?
So often the narrative about migrants in the cities of China and around the world is one that shows that they compete for our resources in the city, they crowd our cities. And we found in the 8 years of working with migrants in China and elsewhere that they truly are an asset. They have a critical role to play in our cities. And we wanted to actually take the message of their contributions to the city and put it in the center of Beijing to really celebrate what they're doing here and the role that they play in our cities.
You use these renovated shipping containers as community centres and other resources for migrant workers in cities around China. What exactly do you have to do to provide these services for them?
Well, years ago, when we first opened that very first community center on the northeast corner of Beijing, we heard that the community was quite unstable, and so we had to be careful about how much we invested into that community center. And sure enough, within 3 years or so, the entire community was demolished with a 3 weeks notice, and of course our community center was caught up in that process. And so we began to rack our brains. How do we create something that's quality and durable, innovative, creative, but at the same time could be moved with the community if the community needs to move? And so we began to reimagine shipping containers. And I remember we had some Legos sitting in our office, and that created our first model of how we were going to put together this shipping container community center, which we now call Community Cubes. And ultimately it is durable, it is creative, it is innovative, but it can be moved if it needs to be. And so we began to work with architects in London, in San Francisco, in Shanghai, and Hong Kong to see how we might reimagine that. And so over time that's led us to create this series of what we call community cubes that we began to open up in other cities as well.
Let's go back a bit. We're in Beijing now. You began in Beijing. How did this all start? Where did the idea from Included come from?
I had been in Beijing for about 2 years. I had come over on a US government scholarship program, intending to go into the State Department as a career. And I love politics. I use diplomacy every day in my life, working here in China and with our team, with our staff and our partners. But a friend took me out into a migrant community on the edge of Beijing back in 2005. And I've been really fortunate in my lifetime to be able to be involved in social issues, volunteering since the age of 13 in several countries around the world. That's informed my worldview. But I don't know what happened when I walked out of that community that day. It was almost like an engine that was lying dormant inside of me all of those years suddenly got flipped on. And I was certainly overwhelmed by the need that I saw, but I was really energized too by what might be done. And so one thing led to the next, and we began to, we started Included, back then known as Compassion for Migrant Children. Many times people say, they praise me for opening this organization and say, how did you make that career choice? And I say, well, it's actually just selfish. I just wanted to sleep. I had so much energy that I didn't know what to do with around this issue that I needed to respond in some way. And so I just, to have peace of mind, I decided to do this instead full time.
Now, the work that you actually do is with migrant workers. These are this huge army of people that are coming from the countryside to the cities in China. First of all, what are the challenges that they face when they come to these cities?
So migrants in China and around the world are pouring into the cities from the countryside in unprecedented numbers, and we see it changing the world as we know it. The United Nations says that 1 in 6 people in the world today live in a migrant community or a migrant slum, and within 2 or 3 short decades that number will double to 1 in 3. So if you can imagine, a third of the world's population living in a migrant community is certainly in many ways the issue of the century, we believe. So when they flow into the cities, they're searching for a better quality of life. And what happens though is they bounce back on these informal edges. They have informal education, They have informal jobs, they have informal healthcare, informal housing. In essence, we can see that they're living informal lives on the edges of our cities, but they contribute so much in our cities, and so we feel like we need to give them a basic level of reward for their contributions. We as an organization decided that we would open community centers, and so in those community centers, it does become a living room of that community where they can try to rebuild the social fabric that was ripped up as they moved from the countryside. And you have to understand the historic nature, and it took us a long time to understand the context that we're working in. Many of these migrants have been living in those villages, their home villages, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, where an incredibly tight social fabric gets woven together, and that again gets ripped apart as they move into the city. And so how do you recreate that? How do you strengthen the communities? And these community centers, we attempt to make them living rooms, platforms for them to rebuild that sense of community. On the other hand, we're very concerned about the practical, pragmatic outcomes, the results of our activities with the migrants. And so we have early childhood development programs that are quite rigorous for the very young children, and sometimes we include their mothers as well in that class. We have after-school programs where hundreds and hundreds of kids pour in from the surrounding, usually unlicensed, illicit migrant schools where they're studying during the daytime, and we give them homework tutoring and extracurricular activities as well.
So it sounds like it's not so much just the physical benefits that you're giving them, but a lot of it has to do with social interaction and getting people to work together.
When we first started, I thought that we should focus only on the very basics, whether it be education or housing. And within probably 6 months, I was taught a lesson. I was reminded that we as human beings are fuller creatures than just the physical aspect. And so our emotional and mental and psychological needs are very important too. And that's when we began to also look at bringing the arts and bringing culture in alongside of that. And it seemed a luxury to me at first, and that's why I had that opinion. But I was taught a lesson that we are full human beings, and all of those aspects and dynamics of life we embody.
Apart from that loss of community that the migrants face when they come to the cities, what about the new community here? They do face a population that's settled here. Is it disinterest? Is it rejection? Is it outright hostility that they face when they come to the cities in China?
I think generally speaking, a lot of it comes down to a lack of understanding. We don't have a chance to connect with each other in day-to-day life, and what we don't understand, what we don't know, we oftentimes fear. We can see that the cities of China, Beijing, Shanghai, etc., have burgeoned. They've grown quite incredibly over the last even 10 to 15 years. And I think that can create some anxiety for those who have been living here for a very long time, whether it be competing for their jobs, competing for their resources.
Indeed, speaking up from the people in the cities here, the argument you hear is that we have limited resources, these people are coming into our cities, and there simply isn't enough for all of us. Right. What do you say to those people who are living in the cities and are worried about losing their resources to what they see as incomers from other places?
Well, as we worked with migrants over the last 8 years, one of the things that we found very clearly is that they truly are an asset in our cities. It's not about, we should start from the point of humanity as we engage each other in this life. But the reality is migrants, and it's proven, are an asset to this city. They help build the cities, they build all the buildings around us, they help grow the economies. When we see an increase of the migrant population in any city, we see an increase in the economy of that city. Migrants who come in from the countryside contribute 3 times more to the GDP than if they had remained in the countryside. I think the other aspect to that is that generally speaking, they're not competing for the same jobs. In the last 20 to 30 years where migration has really been an issue in China, the majority migrant used to be the father in the construction industry who lived on site, or the oldest daughter who went to the factories in southern China. And I'm not an economist, but the trend that I saw is probably 10 plus years ago, we had this burgeoning middle class in China. And what does a burgeoning middle class require? They require many more services. So who can work in the service industry, the service sector? An entire family can. And so that's when we began to see entire families coming into the cities. And I think that ultimately speaking, this middle class demands more waiters and waitresses at the restaurants, so they're eating out more. They demand more mechanics to fix the larger amount of cars that they're buying. And so migrants, if they were pushed out of the city today, they're playing such a crucial role at certain levels within the city. If they were pushed out of the city today, the city would grind to a halt. Even if you look at the financial district, the phone lines would no longer be installed, the plumbing would no longer be fixed, the toilets would begin to become quite a messy place. And so we should have a deep appreciation for the role that they play. Our lives are better because migrants are in our cities.
When we think of migrant communities around the world, people often think of the Philippines, Indonesia, South America, these vast favela-type slums. China isn't known for this absolutely abject poverty, but you seem to be concentrating here in China. Why is that?
It is true that we don't use the word slum in China. It's not as slummish here as we see infrastructurally
Beijing doesn't seem to have those shanty towns on its outskirts, which you do see in other developing countries. These people may live in poor housing, but it doesn't look that much like the slums we're used to.
We do have shanty towns, and I can certainly take you to the farther edges of Beijing where the infrastructure is quite broken down. But reality is that they face many of the similar issues other than infrastructure. They face many of the same issues as we see in slums around the world, this issue of informality, informal education, healthcare, housing, etc. They really can't access a city. And I think that ultimately explains why they can't move up into the middle class when we see their urban counterparts who have also been quite poor over the last 1 or 2 generations or even decades be able to quickly move up as the world's economy has grown, the city's economy have grown, been quickly able to move up into the middle class. But these are outsiders. And so they're working perhaps harder than you and I are working. Their kids are studying certainly probably harder than our kids are studying. And so we would work towards a future that our cities are inclusive of migrants and that they're viewed based on their contributions to the cities, not based on their identity as a migrant. That should become a secondary identity. I think I've really become to believe in the journey and the story of a migrant, their eager willingness to contribute, their appreciation for opportunity. It's what has really grown our cities in many ways. But they just need a fair, formal playing ground. We need to create pathways and on-ramps for them to come into our cities. It's a different issue somewhat, but if you look at immigration, cross-border international immigration, if I was to ask you which 2 cities in the world have been most characterized by immigration, you probably would say New York and London. And if I was to ask you again which 2 cities are the most powerful in the world, you probably would say New York or London. And I think there are many dynamics behind that, but it's no coincidence that, again, this eager energy to contribute, to make a better life for oneself and for the future of their kids, that's tremendously helpful for the city that these migrants live in.
Now, working as an NGO in China presents certain challenges. Do you work in conjunction with government bodies here? Do you get official help? Do you find that the government in the cities particularly are quite eager to work with you, or do you face problems?
When we first began Included, I knew that we wanted to do something of scale, but to do something of scale in China, you have to have the government's at least tacit approval. And so we began to sit down with government departments from education and healthcare and whatnot, and explained what we wanted to do. And they did their job as government officials really well. They listened politely, they smiled, and they never called us back. And they really shouldn't have. We had no money, we had no model, we had no influence. I was white, still am. We had nothing to show to them, and they had a million other things to pay attention to. And I thought, how do we achieve this? To get there, to get scale, we have to have their involvement. But to get their attention, we have to first have something of scale. And so we began to work as quickly and as fast as possible to create something big enough that they could pay attention to. And it took about 3 or 4 years of constantly, genuinely, authentically working day in and day out in these migrant communities, opening more and more community centers. And gradually we began to see them take notice and began to see them take steps towards us. Now, for the last 3 years, the Beijing government has given us funding for the operation of the community centers. The Shanghai government last year gave us quite significant funding towards the operation of the community centers. We were allowed to register as a national level fund in China, which allows us to receive donations in China, give tax-deductible receipts. They invited us to register as a local NGO in Shanghai, which we successfully did. And so our story in interacting with the government in China is largely a positive one.
Presumably the government would be invested in this because if things don't go right, that's instability, and the government in China is certainly obsessed with stability above all. So presumably what you're doing is actually of benefit to them. Is this the same in cities across China? Is there recognition of how important this is?
Certainly the government is very aware of their context, and they do understand that ultimately they will include migrants into their cities. I think that in China, and the numbers could be up to 250 million more, some in the government would even say up to 500 million more migrants flooding from the countrysides into the cities.
This is over what sort of time period?
2 to 3 decades. It's very quickly going to happen. We see very positive steps that the government has been taking. In Shanghai, for instance, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, they announced that they would begin to get the migrant children into the formal education system. And over the course of 4 years, they step by step did that. They either upgraded current unlicensed migrant schools and gave them more resource and more formal training, or they accepted them into the current formal education facilities. And so we can see there an example where they are considering the future of these children. It is in everyone's best interest for these kids and for their families to be included. I think China is very unique and very positive in the sense that they have finally made their Tier 2 and Tier 3 cities viable economic options for their migrants coming from the farms. India hasn't achieved that yet. Many countries around the world have not achieved that yet. So while China is unique in the largest numbers of migration are happening here.
They're not all
within
coming
China.
to Beijing and Shanghai.
No longer are they all coming to Beijing and Shanghai. And so I think that we in China, and China as a government, has a chance to get it right here.
There's one other hurdle that faces migrant workers in China, particular to here, not to other countries, and that is a system called a Hukou, which sort of links you to your place of birth and your family through your father. And as you mentioned, migrant schools, and you talked about them integrating them. It should be pointed out here that migrants in many Chinese cities don't have the rights to the social welfare and education and health that the urban residents do. This Hukou system, this sort of internal apartheid, does that affect the people you work with? Is it something that they resent?
I think they've learned to live with it. They've grown up under this system since the 1950s, largely, and that did keep them in their place of birth for many decades within China. But when Deng Xiaoping began to open the economy in the 1980s, they essentially turned a blind eye and allowed migrants to flow into the cities where they were needed at. And it's not that different than the Hukou would be very similar to the Social Security card, for instance, in the US. It's what ties you to your benefits. The difference is that in the US, I can move my child to Washington State or to Washington, DC at any moment, and within probably a month or even a few days enroll him in the school there. We'd be able to access the hospitals there. So it can move, our benefits can move with us as we move. But the formality of our citizenship can move with us as we move locations within that country. And the same is not true here in China. I don't know that in some ways it's that different than the internal illegal immigrant situation in the United States. We appreciate their contributions, but at the same time we've not given them formal status. We benefit from their contributions, but we've not given them the rewards that they're due. And I think that very similarly in China, we have a lot of improvement to make in truly integrating these migrants into society. It's not about charity. It's not about handouts. It's not about satisfying their demands. They are the most entrepreneurial element in our society, and given the right chance, they will certainly help grow our cities. Migrants in Beijing are 100 times more entrepreneurial than their urban counterparts, and so they just need a chance.
So you're creating the conditions for them to thrive?
The cities across Asia and Africa that are dealing with this issue, and they're all dealing with this issue in the developing world, those cities that are the smartest will create these formal pathways, and we'll be able to look back in 20, 30, 40 years and see that these cities are the strongest in these regions.
You, when you set up, were called Compassion for Migrant Children. You've changed that name now to Included. Why the change in emphasis?
There's a few reasons behind that. One of them was, well, certainly it's a bit Victorian of a name, and we were pigeonholed when people saw that. Two is that
as a Victorian organization,
as maybe an out-of-touch, less modern nonprofit organization, and we feel like we're quite pioneering and innovative, and it gave the wrong message, I think. But that's probably a side note. We can work through that. The real issue is that we, from the start, realized within 6 months that to fully address the needs of a child, we had to also look at their family environment, their school environment, and ultimately their community environment. And the adage it takes a village to raise a child, we do believe that. So their surroundings are quite important. So almost from the beginning, we've had programs for the early childhood years, for teenagers, for the parents, for the teachers, for the adults in the community. The child still is at the core, but certainly we've been engaging the larger community for a long time, and so it was time to upgrade our name because of that. The second reason is that years ago, probably 4 years ago now, we explicitly stated that we wanted to have a seat at the table with a global conversation happening on migrant issues and actually happening on cities around the world. And we knew that we were quite young as an organization, and I wasn't sure how seriously we would be taken, but we're so focused on this issue, we're so committed to this issue, and we've tried to really dig deep and understand the issue both in China and elsewhere, that we wanted to be the token young person, so-called young person on that boardroom of
the adults table.
At the adults table, right? And as we began to go to conferences that were hosted by the UN and other cities conferences we often find ourselves at, people would see our name, Compassion for Migrant Children, essentially verbally pat us on the head and thank us for our good work with children and then scoot us off. And we were seen as a children's charity. Right. And what right do you have to sit at the big adults table? And we wanted to show them that we were serious about this. You know, we are very serious about working and continuing to work at the community level. That is the core of what we do. We have a goal of 100 community centers. We're at 27 right now with we and our partners, and so we are consistently every day that takes a lot of our time and a lot of our energy. So it always nagged at the back of my mind that if we were able to achieve this somehow seemingly impossible even task of creating healthy and vibrant migrant communities, they still would remain healthy and vibrant migrant communities on the edges of our cities. And so we began several years ago to also work at the city level to try to build out a sense of the context of the China and global migrant slum context, so that we can begin to engage the governments about how they're looking at integrating their migrants long term into their cities. And so last year we created a platform called the Center for Migrant Slums. We call it Included.think. And the idea is that it takes the learnings and the lessons and the data and the information from slums around the city and around the world and try to package that in ways that are simple and with a simple story that can be told to different key stakeholders, whether it be the government, whether it be other nonprofit leaders, whether it be academia, to tell very simple stories so that we can know our context, we know where we've come from, we know where we're at, and hopefully we know where we're going in the future. So we have a better chance at changing the situation of migrant slums. Migrant slums today, migrant slums have been around for 50 or 60 years in this world. And the difference when I look at pictures 50 years ago and I look at pictures today in many areas, the key difference is the color in the photos. There's not been a lot of advancement in this area. So how do we avoid 2050 having the same environment? I think it really is having a deep understanding of our context and being able to tell the simple story.
This, you get these shipping containers donated, you've got volunteers as well, but money is involved. Funding, where does it come from? Who pays for this?
When we first started, we started with $1,000, my entire life savings, $1,000 US out of my living room. And so any funds that we get is very dear to us, even today, 8 years later. We had a few different entities take a real chance on us early on within the first year or two. One of them said, "You're our riskiest investment we've ever made, donation that we've ever made in our career." But they really got behind the vision and believed in that. We've had a lot of banks, international banks. Deutsche Bank has been around for a very long time, 7 to 8 years. Many other banks have lined up behind them as well. We've had foundations that bring money in.
These are businesses and banks which are set up to make money. What do they get out of it? Why will they give you money?
Internationally, there's a concept, historically, that it is good to be seen as getting involved in your communities. And we're fortunate to have worked with many of these companies who have very genuine teams that believe that is true. But ultimately, they do also get a benefit because their employees appreciate that they're involved in their communities, that they're working for a company who cares about the larger city in which they're making money. Ultimately, it's a visibility benefit, a communications benefit when they're able to talk to the public that they are involved. It does matter. Many reports have come out over the last decade that says it positively impacts their bottom line if they're giving into their communities. But ultimately, every time I fly back into the Beijing airport, a beautiful terminal, I get on this really nicely done airport highway. I look to my left, there's a BMW. Look to my right, there's a Mercedes. And you realize again, you're forced to understand that there's so much resource in China. And so we are embarking on what we call a China for China strategy, where we're working with influential Chinese and entrepreneurs and businesses so that they take ownership financially of the organization here in China. They get behind the Chinese country director and really help support them.
In China, in a city like Beijing, we can see poor migrant children on the streets as we visited shops like this. Most people look away. Why didn't you?
I think it really struck a chord in me about inclusion. Ever since I was a young child, when I look back now, I can reflect on that phase of my life. I realized that inclusion was really important to me. I probably didn't call it inclusion back then, but I saw myself trying to pull those on the edges of our communities into the center circle. And I noticed that, particularly in the teenage years, we always have those on the edges. You and I have probably been on the edge sometimes ourselves as well. But I noticed that when I began to go and talk to them, something very interesting happened with the dynamics of the group. Others would begin to come over and place more value on them as well. And ultimately, they would begin to be brought back into the larger group. And I think that migrants are the ultimate outsider in our cities. It's not right. It's definitely not fair because they're contributing so much. But it's an issue of our humanity as well and how we want to the types of cities that we want to live in, the types of societies that we want to build and leave behind for our children. I know you and I both have very young children that we care deeply about, and we do want to leave, I believe, a legacy behind, a world that is better for them, that's more fair, more right, more inclusive. So I think it struck a chord with me.
What are the goals of Included.org for 2025?
There's a tremendous market space to grow, obviously, for us as an organization. There are so many migrants around the world, and so we could do that endlessly. Even here in Beijing, I think that would take a lifetime of work. Somewhere along the line a few years ago, we realized that there is not a global narrative about the migrant community and migrant slum situation. And so we made a choice at that time that, well, number one, we were shocked that there was no global narrative after all these years that the situation has been around. You know, we have HIV/AIDS, clean water, rural development. All of these have a certain sense. We know our context. We know certain best practices. And so now it comes down to a time of resources, political willpower, and time to really advance on these issues. We don't have the same thing in migrant slums for whatever reason. Perhaps it's so complex. And so we made a decision strategically, instead of going incredibly deep in one area and full in one area, to take our resources and spread it across a network of nodes that are sharing information back and forth. And so we are in 4 cities right now. Ultimately, we want to weave together a network of 10 cities around the world and 100 community centers that are learning together, that are sharing information together, that we're able to compare and contrast about what's working in Mumbai versus Jakarta versus Beijing versus Nairobi, and hopefully be able to see what is best practice. And hopefully the worst practice among all of us will begin to drop to the bottom, the best practice can float to the top, and we really have a chance by 2050 to be able to have a different situation. Now certainly we're just one organization among many. Collaboration is in our DNA, collaboration with all sectors, not even just the nonprofit sector. And so I'm not at all saying that this is something that Included will achieve on ourselves, but why not work in a smart way? Why not try to fill the gap? Why not try to offer something of value, even if we're small, even if we're young? And it's been interesting to see that we've been given a voice, we've been given a platform, that very large institutions and old institutions and government leaders have actually responded to this. Perhaps it's because our tone, perhaps we come in ambitious, but hopefully not aggressive. We come in with a collaborative approach, and I think that's something that, you know, if we can add new and fresh ideas to the conversation, that's what we would like to be about.
Jonathan Hursh, best of luck with Including the Excluded, and thank you for coming on the level.
Thanks for having me.